Okay, are we? I guess we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Mel Asuncion from Veritas Southeast Asia. I have been with Veritas since 2009, working on labor issues on various industries, more currently focused on palm oil and seafood. The webinar, well, Fraser is supposed to introduce the webinar series, but I think he's still trying to dial in. In any case, the first session of the labor webinar series, organized by the FITF and also the Human Rights Working Group, is on forced and child labor risks in Indonesia and Malaysia. Just very briefly about Verite, we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to ensure that workers worldwide work under fair, safe, and legal conditions. We have been a social NGO member of the RSPO since 2013, and currently we are an alternate SNGO member in the Board of Governors. We're also a member of the DSF. I sit in the complaints panel, and we are chairing the labor task force within the Human Rights Working Group. Our first engagement with RSPO was during the PNC review in 2012, and immediately after after the approval of the 2013 PNC through our program with Solidaridad, we conducted trainings for growers in Malaysia
Hi,
and
Mel.
Indonesia.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can
Yes.
hear you now. I
Okay.
started
I'm so
because
sorry,
I was
everybody.
told to start.
I called in 3 different times, and it just said like I had to wait for the webinar to start, and I knew it was already started. So, my sincere apologies. Um, I want to just I'm sorry to cut you off as you started to get going there, Mel.
No problem.
I I wanted to introduce the webinar series and also introduce our fantastic speaker Mosel Asuncion from Verite Southeast Asia, and a friend of mine and a colleague on the complaints panel. Mel is a lawyer by profession and is a research and stakeholder engagement programs manager at Verite Southeast Asia. She's been managing research projects and multilateral stakeholder initiatives on not just palm oil, but also seafood, electronics, garments, and is engaging various stakeholders in government, labor, industries, and multinational companies on critical labor issues throughout Southeast Asia, but also East Asia, the Middle East. She's part of Verite's global research team, working on trafficking and forced labor in formal manufacturing and agriculture across Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, she's on the complaints panel for the roundtable on the RSPO, of course. Prior to working at Verite, she worked in various human rights and development issues involving women, the environment, indigenous people, legal empowerment, and access of justice to vulnerable groups. She has a Master's of Arts in Human Rights from Mahidol University in Thailand and a Bachelor of Law from the University of Philippines, and has been serving as a member on the Philippine Bar since 2002. So right before I turn it back over to Mel, I just wanted to give a quick update. As most of you know, this is the first of a series of 4 webinars that will cover labor risks and labor rights in palm oil and particularly on palm oil plantations. The first of the series will, today's webinar, will look at forced labor and child labor and the differences in the legal systems as well as how those risks play out in Malaysia and Indonesia. The second webinar will take place on Thursday, same time, same place, but 8 p.m. Singapore, 8 a.m. Eastern, 12 noon, 2 p.m. in Central European time, and that will look at minimum wage, carnet system, health and safety, and other kind of on-the-ground environmental and social issues on plantations. And then the third webinar on October 7th will look at freedom of association and unions. Sorry, September 7th. I will send out the whole schedule so that it's clear for everybody, and I'll get the list of attendees so that everyone who's attending today can continue to attend in the future. On October, the first Thursday in October, we will then have a webinar on where do we go from here, what have we learned from this series, and how can we take what we've learned and transform that into policies or implementation procedures or principles and criteria inside of the RSPO. So the goal is to kind of have this discussion prior to the RT in Bali, and continue the conversation on at that stage. So the major objective here is education, sensitization, and building knowledge, really knowledge building around labor, so that we can have a more informed and just knowledge-based conversation around labor amongst all stakeholders in the RSPO. So again, thank you so much for joining, and Mel, thank you so much for putting together this presentation. We should have it all circulated for those whose technology isn't working to be able to view it, but it's also being viewed on the GoToWebinar site. So without further ado, Mel, please pick up again where you started, and I apologize for cutting everything off there.
No problem. Thank you, Fraser. So just to continue my brief introduction of our work on palm oil and more particularly with the RSPO. So immediately after the 2013 PNC was approved, through our program with Solidaridad, we've done trainings for growers in Malaysia and Indonesia and for the CBs as well, because we realized that there's a lot to know and a lot of upskilling that needs to happen if we are to guarantee that labor is protected within the RSPO supply chain. We've also conducted test audits of smallholders in Sabah under this program. In 2015, through the help of Oxfam, we did a comprehensive analysis of the RSPO social auditing process that's available publicly. And more recently, I've been conducting audits of plantations to benchmark and identify gaps in practices. In other parts of the world, we have been doing research on as you would see in your screen, we've been doing risk analyses of palm oil sectors in other countries like Ecuador and Guatemala. This year, we launched our program with Wilmar, focused on Indonesia, and also our program with Mars to ensure that the systems and processes are fit for purpose, and really to show proof that the RSPO PNC can actually be met. You can see a lot of the resources on this website. We have a commodity atlas, and we have a specific page on palm oil. Okay, the way I've divided my presentation in 3 parts. The first part is on the legal basis of child labor and forced labor, and then I will go on to discuss how these issues manifest in estates in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then the third part would be on what can be done in the short, medium, and long term. Okay, child labor is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. It refers to work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful to children, and interferes with their schooling by depriving them of the opportunity to attend school, obliging them to leave school prematurely, or requiring them to attempt to combine school attendance with excessively long and heavy work. ILO has already clarified that not all work done by children should be classified as child labor that is targeted for elimination. So because we keep hearing that, especially in smallholder farms, that children are not really working as such because they're only helping their parents. We hear that it's just that it's also clear that any work undertaken by a child should not interfere with their schooling, which then translates to their physical and mental development. So a lot of these work that is allowed to be done by children are really light work that is done to help their parents rather than to, on its own earn a living. Under Indonesian law, a child is described as someone below 18 years. So the legal minimum age of work is 18 years old and above. It also says that between 13 to 15 years of age, only light work is allowed that does not stunt or disrupt their physical, mental, and social development. That is restricted by Article 74, which prohibits employing and involving children in worse forms of child labor, even if the work is undertaken as part of their work, their job to help their families. The worst forms of child labor is defined as all these four. I hope everybody's seeing my screen, but in any case, I'll go through it very quickly. So any form of slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as sale and trafficking of children, another kind of activity that is prohibited is involving children in prostitution, pornography, or production or pornographic performances, or anything that involves drugs, and in general work which by its nature or circumstances is likely to harm the health, safety or morals of children. I highlighted health and safety of children because then we need to figure out whether work in plantations can be classified as something that is not harmful to the health and safety of children. In Malaysia, the main law is at 350 on children and young persons, and it defines a child as someone who's less than 14 years old. A child is allowed to take part in light work that is carried on by his family, or in any undertaking carried on by his family, or as part of public entertainment. I would suppose these are the actors or those involved in the arts, or as part of a government approved training program, or a program that is under a written apprenticeship contract approved by the Director General. It's further limited by provisions on working hours, so it should not be more than 6 hours a day and only between 7:01 a.m. to 7:59 p.m. If the young person is still in school, it should not be more than 7 hours, including the time spent attending school. The rest period should be 30 minutes. There should be rest period for 30 minutes after 3 consecutive hours of work. And there's guaranteed rest day, which should not be less than 14 consecutive hours that is free from work. Malaysian law also defines what a young person means, and this is someone who's younger than 16 years old. So someone who's younger than 16 years old can be allowed to work can be allowed to do light work suitable to his capacity, whether or not that undertaking is carried on by his family. So it can be as a domestic servant, working in the shop, even industrial undertaking suitable to his capacity, or any vessel under the personal charge of his parent or guardian. However, they are not allowed near machines for obvious reasons. Working hours not more than 7 hours a day between 6 a.m. to before 8 p.m. If the young person is still in school, the work should he or she should not be working more than 8 hours, including the time spent attending school. Rest period should be every 30 minutes after every 4 consecutive hours, and then rest day for not less than 12 consecutive hours. I have to say though that we need to see when this law was enacted. Yeah, it was enacted in 1966. So we need to have some kind of reflection whether it is still something that is needed. You know, if there's still such a big need at this point in time. 1966 is very different from 2017. So obviously, the law needs to be updated, and because of the move towards having the legal minimum age at 18 years old across the globe and across industries. In terms of the keys, consistent with the Verite approach of studying both the macro macro context and the micro context, I start with some key systemic challenges that we've seen in palm oil. So first is plantations are remote without easy access to schools. So even if parents want to send their children to school, sometimes physically it's just not possible, or in terms of finances, it's not possible, because then that would mean putting them in boarding schools, and the costs can be quite prohibitive. Also, so that's both true in Indonesia and Malaysia. In Malaysia, more particularly, undocumented children cannot enroll in public and government schools. In areas where there are Humana schools, then they can go and finish their primary education, no questions asked. But after primary education, when they need to go to high school or secondary education, they need to be able to show that they are in the country legally. And for most of the children of migrant workers and plantations born already in Malaysia and cannot get any kind of documentation because the Malaysian government does not document them, then it's impossible to get to secondary school. How we've seen the practices in a lot of plantations are what you're seeing on the screen right now. The parents' monthly earning is not enough to support children's education, and if you have a number of children, then if you have 5 to 7 children, then you'll need to prioritize who goes to school and who doesn't. And more often than not, the girls do not go to school because then the boys will be sent instead. Currently, most companies would have an anti-child labor policy. However, we need to take into account that the amount of the premi, or the bonus, or the kontanan, is significant compared to the minimum wage rate. And then there's also that threat of an actual pay cut for not meeting the quota. And this is what we've seen as driving a lot of parents to bring their children to work, even if the company already makes it clear that it's not allowed. It's just that because the bonus is so much higher than the wage, then yeah, I mean it's easy to see why they're tempted to bring not just their children but also their wives to help them in achieving the target. Certainly, underage laborers or children will not appear in companies' workers' registry. We've never seen it. Of course, companies know better than to put them there, and therefore they're unrecognized. In such a case, then they have no access to training, and they're not given safety equipment. The children that we've seen working in plantations are usually unpaid helpers of their parents, and they're usually assigned to gather these fruits. Okay, that's child labor. I go on now to forced labor. In Indonesia and Malaysia,
So,
as you can
sorry.
see, yes?
Can I ask one question? I'm just
Yes.
wondering, in terms of those kind of circumstances that you're describing, that enable child labor. How widespread would you say that practice is, or the occurrence of those kind of circumstances, those informal environments that kind of enable child labor on plantations? How widespread is that in Indonesia, and how widespread is it in Malaysia? Is there a difference? And yeah.
It's quite common to see young people helping their parents, especially in smallholder farms. So in both countries, it's quite common.
And how common is it, or is it common on industrial plantations, large consolidated plantations, not including smallholders?
In the bigger ones would definitely be more strict in not allowing their workers to bring their families. So, but as you know, the plantations are quite vast, and they cannot monitor every single area of that. So for industrial plantations, I would say it's a bit more. It's less common than in smaller ones, but definitely in smallholder farms, it's a more common sight.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I move on now to forced labor, which is another big issue. So in Indonesia under Article 28E, and in Malaysia under Article 6 of the constitutions, protection against slavery or forced labor is constitutionally guaranteed. Both countries have ratified the ILO Convention 29, and there are both currently in force in these countries. So ILO Convention 29 defines defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. To make it easy, the ILO further broke it down into 3 involuntariness indicators, referring to unfree recruitment, life or work under duress, or the impossibility of leaving the employer, and then menace of penalty. Because together, then we can say there's incident of forced labor. These are the indicators of involuntariness, subcategorized as unfree recruitment. You can see there recruitment linked to debt, which is what's more commonly known as debt bondage. Deception about the nature of the work, deceptive recruitment, which includes contract substitution. Under work and life under duress, we have forced overtime, forced to work on call, limited freedom of movement and communication, and degrading living condition, among others. For impossibility of leaving the employer, it includes no freedom to resign according to legal requirements, or workers are forced to stay longer than agreed while waiting for their wages, or they're forced to work for an indeterminate period in order to repay the debt. The menace of penalty is a bit longer, so it includes denunciation to authorities, confiscation of identity papers or travel documents, what else? Isolation, constant surveillance, withholding of wages. So what it actually means is that when these indicators are found, then they actually vitiate, so they are seen as proof that vitiates against the workers' consent, or the workers' voluntary, the workers' desire to keep working in that job. So when a formula would be something like this. So if there's deception about the nature of the job, and then there's confiscation of passport, then it is seen as an incident of forced labor. Or if there's forced overtime, then workers are keep being threatened that the authorities will come if they don't if they don't follow the rules, then that is also considered an incident of forced labor. Or if there's deceptive recruitment or contract substitution, and then there are financial penalties that can be in many forms. For example, if their salary is deducted because they don't reach the quota, or that if they are punished when they don't come to work by not earning anything, even if they're supposed to be on a monthly compensation scheme, then that's interpreted as financial penalty. Then, together with deceptive recruitment, it is seen as a forced labor situation. What to make it easier, the question that we always ask is, would the worker have chosen to work or have chosen to continue to work had he known the circumstances, the real circumstances of the job, or had he, or whether he would continue to work if he or she can leave. Because then if the answer to both those questions is no, then it can be a forced labor situation. Linking it to traffic, I'm bringing up trafficking in persons because there's a lot of confusion around this. Forced labor and trafficking in persons are not the same. Trafficking in persons refer to the recruitment through the use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception for the purpose of exploitation. So what you see on the screen is the definition according to most trafficking in persons laws, because they follow the Palermo Convention. There are just some variations, because for example in Malaysia, because prostitution is not legal, then it would say for exploitation including prostitution rather than exploitation of prostitution. So if a person was recruited by means of deception for the purpose of forced labor, for example, then that's trafficking in persons. So that's the distinction there. And the main thing that we need to remember about trafficking is that all these three components, the act, means, and purpose, they all have to be there for it to become trafficking. So some of the key systemic challenges that we've seen around that are linked to forced labor are these things. One, the sending and receiving countries have different immigration policies and labor recruitment requirements. In the immigration policy framework is always stronger than the labor protection mechanism. And in Malaysia, for example, it's very easy to lose your legal working status. So if for example the employer dismisses you for no reason, then you become an undocumented worker. Instead of being seen as a victim, then the law usually sees them as violating immigration laws. So then they are subject to detention and eventually after many years deportation. In Malaysia, there's still no coherent policy on foreign workers. There's still a lot of confusion around the rights of foreign workers. The laws on recruitment fees are still not clear or non-existent in many countries. There's inadequate regulation over labor providers or labor recruiters or labor brokers. And as we've seen in our work in the last 10 years, a lot of these problems really come from the practices of the labor recruiters. In Malaysia in particular, what we've seen is that there is no mechanism for the levy refund whenever the worker wants to pre-terminate the contract. Just to elaborate a bit on it, whenever a company hires a foreign worker, then there's the foreign worker levy. And that levy is paid in advance by the employer for a 12-month period. So if the worker wants to quit on the 6th month for many reasons, then he or she needs to pay back the balance of that. So that's 6 months worth of it. And then that becomes actually a way to hold the worker to the work, because more often than not, he or she doesn't have the money to pay back the balance of the levy, and the employer doesn't have any way to refund it from the government. So we've seen that as a driver of forced labor in this case. In plantations, these are the indicators that we've seen more commonly. There's higher recruitment fees. There's obviously limited freedom of movement, not just because of where they are, but also because of how the housing facilities are set up. A lot of them have been deceived about the kind of work that they would do coming to Malaysia. I've seen really bad living conditions, especially in plasma and smallholder farms. And degrading living conditions is actually not, it's not top of mind when people think about forced labor. There's widespread passport withholding. The workers are unable to resign in accordance with the legal, the legal provision, and because they cannot resign without suffering some form of penalty like heavy fine or losing their passport. And we've also seen various forms of financial penalties. So that's forced labor. Before I leave this subtopic, I just want us to be reminded that a lot of a lot of the pressure around forced labor or anti-forced labor initiatives are, of course, these things. You have the UK Modern Slavery Act. You have the US Trade Facilitation Enforcement Act. We're hearing that the due diligence law in France will be passed soon, and we're also hearing that Australia is preparing to have their own version of something like a UK Modern Slavery Act. So it's not just the RSPO that's requiring this now. A lot of the pressure is coming from abroad in the form of legal pressure. Okay, I think I have about 20 minutes. So what can we do? I'm showing this. This is, I don't know if people are seeing the screen, but what I have on the screen is an iceberg, because this is how we hope people would start thinking about issues of child labor and forced labor, or even freedom of association. That what we're seeing are usually just events, and we need to be addressing what's driving the practices. So we need to go down and do our root cause analysis, so that we are addressing the root cause of the problem rather than just what we're seeing on the surface or what our auditors are telling us that's happening. The most important thing that we need to be doing is we need to be understanding our risks. So if you're a company hiring a huge number of migrant workers, you need to be doing your risk mapping. You need to know how your workers are able to, and how your workers joined your company, or how workers are able to enter your supply chain. Because by understanding your risks, then you'll be able to do what needs to be done that's a fit that fits your purpose. So it can be risk mapping, it can be focus investigation. I would strongly recommend like Malaysian companies to be doing this, trying to understand where their workers are coming from. Even if they're being hired through the government program, especially now with the Bangladeshi workers, they still need to understand how those workers are even pulled in Bangladesh, because we've seen it happening that even with the government program that is very clear already on what fees need to be paid, people still find a way to make money of these workers, and you wouldn't want that to be in a, you wouldn't want to not know about it, and you would really want to know what to do when you find, like, workers who are deceived that are already part of your supply chain. So there should be some sort of corrective action or remediation that will happen. The next thing would be, strengthen your structure, and you will need to anchor your practice on clear policies and processes covering fees, passports, reimbursement, up until return or repatriation of workers. You need to strengthen how your internal auditors are identifying the problems, and this is both for child and forced labor. Yeah, this is not just for forced labor, because you need to understand. For example, you have a clear policy. You already say, look, you guys, you can't bring your children. If they keep bringing their children, you need to understand why, and you need to be able to. You need people who will tell you that this is happening, because otherwise, one day you wake up, you're in the newspaper, and you're just caught with your pants down or something. So it's important that you yourself know what your risks and issues are before somebody else tells you. There's, of course, capacity building. A lot of, more often than not, people think that child and forced labor is something that you just understand, but they're actually, as we've seen in this presentation, there are legal bases for that, and it's not just, you can't just take them in their common understanding. It's very technical, and so we all need to understand what it means. There's also, like, making sure that you are getting information from the workers, and there are many ways to do that, because the workers, especially in terms of recruitment, they're probably your only source of information. So they need to know they need to know that what happened to them, and also understand what was wrong with what happened to them, so that you will get that information, you'll be able to act, and then scale solutions to the rest of your supply chain. I'm showing this because the yellow ones are the social responsibility risks. So if you don't have a strong recruitment or hiring process, then that's where you can have issues of discrimination, or child labor, forced labor, bonded labor. If you are not very clear on your compensation and benefits in the way that they comply with law, then that's where wage issues, or rest days or excessive OT can happen. So know your process, know your risks, first in your own business, and then along your supply chain. So this is just, this is actually an ideal, what we think should be happening when you're, for example, when you're hiring migrant workers through a labor recruitment agency, because then you can have, these are where all these risks can happen. And unfortunately, if you don't involve yourself in recruiting your workers, then you kind of know about it much too late, because then by that time you only see them when they arrive at your plantation. A lot of things have happened, and then you have no choice but to remediate rather than prevent such things from happening. There are ethical recruitment resources that are available online. These are just two. We have an ethical framework paper that's available on our website, and there's also the responsiblesourcingtool.org, where you can have, where there are a number of tools that you can use And then these are some sample controls. So if recruitment is outsourced, then you must have a broker selection, monitoring, and orientation. You must have a post-arrival verification so that you're sure that you're not hiring underage workers and that they have not been paying excessive fees, etc. But these are just some. I guess I stop there and open the open it for questions. I'm not sure how to do it with Fraser.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, no problem. So everybody can ask questions via the chat function. I realized I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Fraser Lanier from Citibank, coordinating the webinar series and also coordinate the Financial Institutions Task Force. So what you can do is just type into chat your questions, and we already have a couple, so I'll just go ahead and read those out. So the first question is, how is the RSPO to act when it is found that some RSPO accredited certification bodies suspected to implement forced labor for their auditor? So I guess are tasked with reviewing forced labor as an audit. The indicator is certification bodies sent their auditor for training externally. Certification bodies paid all costs and expenses for the training. Then when the auditor completed the training, auditor shall sign an agreement for some sort of contract to stay working for the company within a certain time. If the auditor terminates themselves before completion of that time, they should pay certain money as penalties. What I'm understanding from that question is I don't completely understand the question, but
no, it's actually it's like a training bond. You know, like when your employer sends you for training, and then you're asked to sign that, you know, if you leave within a certain period of time, you have to pay back the money, the training fee. Well, ours. Should I answer? Our stance, yeah, our stand on training bond is this: if the training redounds to the benefit of the employer, why should the employee pay for it? Yeah. So if it's a skills improvement, or a skill, what is that? Some sort of like qualification that the worker needs to have in order to do his or her job. Or okay, more simply, if for example the employer brings in a new kind of equipment and they need to send off somebody to operate that equipment, you know, to learn how to operate that equipment, why should the worker pay, you know, sign for a training bond? Because then, I mean, what does the worker do with that kind of knowledge without the equipment? So you know, simply, if the work, like sending auditors to go through forced labor training, to do forced labor that the company needs to do as part of RSPO requirements, then I don't see why the employee needs to pay for that training.
I see. Okay, I'm going to move on to, there's another comment here. The comment is, some companies pay the levy, not the workers. So is it common for companies to actually pay the labor brokerage fee as opposed to the workers, and does that still create situations of indebtedness? Do the workers then pay back the company, or do many companies pay that fee and it's never the worker's responsibility?
Okay, so if the employer is paying the levy, it's fine. You know, it's very good, because then you know, they take on that responsibility. However, if the levy is used to hold the worker to the job, so, because the levy is 12 months, So for example, the worker wants to leave for 2 months, somebody is sick, they need to go back home. And then he is told, okay, but you need to pay off, the 10 months worth of the levy that I paid to the government. Then, yeah, then, if the worker, then that's a way to hold the worker to the side, to the work, even if he or she already wants to leave. So an employer paying the levy for the worker is a good thing, as long as the levy is not used to hold the worker to the job, even if he or she wants to leave already.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna just keep on going through these questions here. We've got a lot of great questions coming in. What guidance can you give for children in smallholder farms? We know they follow parents to work in the farms, but because they're non-Malaysians, or I guess non-Indonesians, if we're talking about Indonesia, they can't go to school, and there are no Humana schools around. Oh, I see. So this is specific to Malaysia. They can't go to school because they're non-Malaysians. How do we mitigate this risk and situation when the children are not actually allowed to go to school?
Well, it's an ongoing conversation actually. Certainly, there are many types of work that needs to be done in smallholder farms. If I mean, this is something that the industry as a whole still needs to think about, because if there's a way for some types of work to be identified as allowed, for not less than 18 years old to do, then we should have that conversation, because this is a very real concern of smallholders and also those sourcing from smallholders. And yeah, I mean, we've received complaints about it, because then if the children are not, if the young adults are not with their parents, then they sometimes get into gangs, etc. So it's a very real situation. It's a very real concern that we have to be thinking about as an industry, because there are things that can be done safely by young adults. We just have to be a bit more deliberate in identifying those areas, because obviously harvesting might not, it's harmful. It's not good for children to be doing, but there are other things that can be done.
Yeah, it's hard labor. Another question, what is your experience, and just to let everybody know, I'm going to try and go over 5 minutes since we started 5 minutes late. We'll see if it'll allow us to, but what is your experience with regard to collaboration with palm oil companies in the field? What is your experience in the sector? Do you see progress? What are the priorities to focus on?
Well, we've just... Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky, because the ones that I've audited are very open to to making improvements. More often than not, it's really about not having enough understanding of why certain things have to happen. So but once they understand, then they see why certain things need to be done, especially around casual workers or the carnet workers. Once they understand the kind of issues that arrangement generates, then they're very open to looking for solutions. So I've been lucky in that sense. And then with the Wilmer program that we've just started, our commitment, both of us, like Wilmar and Bertha, our commitment is to share the solutions that we're testing. So we'll be sharing this to everybody in the RSPO, so that we all work together to test the solutions, and share what works, and also help each other out, because really it cannot be done just by a handful of companies.
Yeah, you mentioned that the law is outdated. Do you have any knowledge that it is being reviewed? I don't know if I
No.
missed it.
Or
Okay.
I'm sure there's been lobbying going on for years, but of course, laws are kind of hard to change.
So can we confirm that holding passports of foreign workers by a company's management is still considered forced labor, although there is consent, even if there's a consent letter by the workers to the company to do so?
It's always tricky because then if there's consent, then we need to test whether the workers have unrestricted access to their passports, which means that if they are kept in an office where only the human resource manager has the key, so then the worker will have to wait for the human resource manager to come to work, etc. So effectively they don't have unrestricted access to their passport. So what is clear is that passport retention is a forced labor indicator. For it to become forced labor, it has to occur with something else. Yeah. So, but yeah. So the test now is whether if the company is keeping it for safekeeping, quote unquote, then the test would be whether the workers have unrestricted access because it's their personal property.
Right. Right. Do you know if there are any existing risk maps of both child and forced labor in Indonesia and Malaysia, and are they available anywhere? Saying it will be very useful to see where are risks and more salient in specific geographic locations, regions in the country.
For sure, ILO has a number of research that they have done on these issues. UNICEF for sure would have something around children. Um, so there are already researches out there, and I think more importantly, they need to understand how these things manifest in their own practices. I mean, if you're a grower, the other stakeholder groups within RSPO, like the banks and the consumer groups, the, there would for sure there are already research documents out there.
Great. And do you see similar problems in Guatemala, say, for example, or across Latin America?
Yes. So, but because to there are forced labor indicators as well, because then, for example, in Ecuador, then we're dealing with a number of refugees coming from Colombia, or is it Guatemala? I can't remember now. But because they have moved and they have this, they don't have legal status to be in the country, then yes, they're the same kind of vulnerability we've seen in Latin America. They can look at the reports that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, because Verita has done research on Guatemala and Ecuador. I don't want to misrepresent our research, so maybe it's better if they can just take a look at those reports.
Okay, where are the reports again?
We have them on our website. Hold on. So if they go to verite.org, they would access the one that we did on Ecuador is in 2016, and the other one on Guatemala is in 2013. So that's
Okay.
www.verite.org.
That's great. So generally, how adequate is the RSPO certification process in identifying these issues of child and forced labor? Does RSPO address adequacy, or is there an additional improvement to the certification approach required?
Well, given the amount of complaints that we're dealing with, and also the reports coming from NGOs, obviously the CBs have not been detecting these issues. And it takes two. Yeah, it's not just their fault. It's also our fault, because then instead of being very explicit in the PNC on what they need to be checking, they barely have any guidance. So that's what we're trying to do with this current PNC review process. I know that it's quite unpopular the way that we're adding, we're putting in additional indicators, especially around forced labor. But the brewers need to see that as we become explicit, then the better it is for the CBs to identify whether or not the risks are present in their plantations. Because if we don't, if we're not explicit, then yeah, they don't even know where to begin to look.
Right. Right. And I think we have one last question. Have you come across a statement, letter, or regulation from the Malaysian authorities allowing oil palm plantations to withhold foreign workers' passports on the grounds of ensuring workers don't jump from one estate to the other after their work permits have been paid for?
No, because the Malaysian government is very clear. It has the Passports Act. So unless we can really show, somebody can show that there is an explicit exception given to agricultural sectors or palm oil sector specifically, then that Passport Act, which prohibits passport retention by anyone else, not that is not lawful, a lawful authority, that remains in place. That should be the law that is being implemented. And really,
Right.
this is a myth. This is a myth. It's not that easy for a worker to move to another employer, because the work permit and the visa are issued under the employer's name. Yeah, so if they move without the employer's consent, then they're actually working illegally.
Oh,
So it's not that easy to move. I mean, this is similar to the kafala system in Middle East. So if they want to change their employer, they cannot even do it in country. They would have to go out, because the memo, how do you call it? The entry memo is processed in the country of origin, and then they get temporary stay in Malaysia while the visa is being processed, and that will be under the new employer's name.
I'll just take one more question, actually, because this is an interesting one as well. And I'm sorry if I haven't gotten to your questions. There were a lot of really fantastic questions, a lot of engagement here. How are funds collected from foreign workers? How are the funds collected from foreign worker levies used? The reason I ask is because obviously it has an unintended consequence for the worker, while the employers feel like they need to recoup their investment. Can there be another way for the government to replace this revenue?
Because the first time we had this conversation with the Malaysian government is when we were doing the electronics research on forced labor in the electronics industry in Malaysia. We brought it up, but I don't think don't quote me on this, but I don't think they're seeing the point. So there, I mean, I can't even answer it because obviously the government handles that fund. I don't know what it is used for, and so far, because that report came out in 2014. It's now 2017, and they haven't changed it. So I'm not very positive that it can. That's suddenly they will change and say okay, but anyway. I
Yeah,
think the
yeah.
Malaysian Trade Union Congress, the MTUC, has been lobbying with the government about this issue.
Okay, thank you so much, Mel, and thanks for the fantastic presentation, putting this together, and thank you to all the participants for your active participation and fantastic questions. The webinar has been recorded, and we will work with the RSPO to send out a recorded version around to the membership. If you have any ongoing questions or want to continue the discussion, please get in touch with the Secretariat, myself, Rachel Lanier, and Mel Asuncion. Do you have any final comments or thoughts, Mel?
We can maybe, because you have the questions that they submitted during the webinar. Maybe you can send to me, and then I can respond to them, and then the secretariat can share with the rest.
I think that's a really good idea. Let's do that. Okay, everybody. Remember, next webinar, August 17th, 8 p.m. Singapore, 8 a.m. The link to sign up to the GoToWebinar has been passed around, but it will be passed around again this week so everybody can sign up. Thanks again, and have a great evening, great afternoon, or great rest of your day, depending on where you are in the world. Bye, everyone.
Bye.